Today we're going to be going ahead. This is episode 2 of the series, Is This a Dream? All right, still waiting to make sure that everything is okay here. Okay, great. Everything's coming through now. It always takes a few seconds for things to start streaming through. Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shaz. Mona, hello. Susan Marathi, hello. Melvin, hello. Looks like people from all over the world. Brazil, Sweden. All right, looks like it just went in and out here. So hopefully this won't be a recurrent problem. So, is this a dream? Last time we got up to the introduction, and I want to start at the introduction again today, pick up where we left off and just mention a couple more things before we move ahead. Hello, Bella. Hello, Bunny. Eliza. And as usual, we're going to start with questions. All right, I did look up some of the questions that were presented after the last talk. All right, it's going in and out again, looks like. All right, let's see how this goes. Okay, so we're going to use this to help direct our attention. Use the words to direct our attention to the awareness, to the consciousness that is already here. The deeper reality which is already here. And that is the purpose of all of these talks, is to reflect in the mind and ultimately release from that thinking mind and experience the stillness that is here. So let's dive right into the questions. Hello, Leticia from London, Natasha. All right. So here's the first question. How do I All right, yeah, this seems to be going in and out. I just switched up one of the connections, so hopefully this will get better. Can you guys hear me again? All right. Looks like it's coming back. Hopefully this will work. I switched up one of the connections here. All right. So let me read the question again, because we've been disrupted a few times. How do I gracefully accept that this consensus reality ultimately doesn't exist how we view it? Okay? But also that we view it as we do. So we're talking about two different experiences of the reality here, right? And in the context of what we've been saying, this is basically talking about that transition state between the first mind and the second mind, right? Why? It's very clear. This consensus reality ultimately doesn't exist how we view it. This is closer to a second mind perspective, right? Because we're seeing that what we're calling reality is basically a particular lens through which we see the world, right? This is closer to a second mind perspective, all right? But then the other half is, but also that we do view it as we do, meaning that the world still appears independently real, right? The objects, the physical objects still appear as physical objects out there independent of me, right? So this is closer to the first mind perspective. So this question is coming from this transition state where it seems like we are having two different perspectives on the world. And in fact, it does appear as two different perspectives, because from the first mind perspective, I'm a localized thing, and there's an independent world out there. From the second mind perspective, my nature is consciousness itself in which the world appears. So here's the key, and let me add on the rest of the statement here. This person writes, it can really make one feel like an outlier and struggle to connect with people that are so entrenched in their perspective, right? How many people feel like that? Make one feel like an outlier, right? I'm sure many people feel that way, right? If you're listening to this call, if you've been listening to the talks the last few weeks, there will be many people that are having the same perspective. And so it can make one feel like an outlier and struggle to connect with people that are so entrenched in their perspectives. Meaning what? Meaning that a person who says, no, this is the way it is, all right? The world is physical, the brain is secondary, consciousness is secondary, all that stuff is secondary. That's one perspective. And another perspective is, no, it's all consciousness, right? My perspective, and the one I communicate, is closer to the second, but how do we actually appreciate all these perspectives without becoming dogmatic and getting caught up with one? And the idea here is to recognize that in the second mind perspective, there are many ways to express this. So the way we are talking now is by saying that consciousness is primary and that all of these experiences are secondary within the second mind, right? However, the very meaning of these words, like consciousness, reality, physical reality, all of these fluctuate as the mind fluctuates. So the key to being able to reconcile all these views, and the key to being able to be okay in conversations, no matter what people are saying and what people are believing, is simply to recognize the lens through which people are seeing the world and talking about the world, right? If we can see the lens, if we can appreciate, not just see, but if we can appreciate the lens through which people are experiencing the world and seeing the world, then there are no contradictions. In fact, that's one of the things in the introduction that we're going to come to today, right? The contradiction arrives, and we experience a contradiction only when we're stuck to the labels that we've been given. Reality is this. Consciousness is this. The physical world is this, right? We have these words and these labels. The problem is the meaning of these labels itself changes, right? As the mind shifts. So the key is simply when somebody says, for example, no, the physical world is primary, the brain is primary, and it creates consciousness, depending on the context, many times I'll say, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Because it's simply the lens through which a person is seeing the world. And through that first mind perspective, the brain looks primary, right? That doesn't contradict the perspective that consciousness is primary. It only contradicts it if we're wedded then even in that appearance, even that in that appearance of consciousness appearing as all of these things, right? If we're experiencing that, then there are no contradictions as an experience. So the contradictions are experienced at the level of ideas, and if our identity is wedded to those ideas. All right? So let me say that again. The contradictions are experienced at the level of the ideas and at the level of the meaning of the words, and our identity being dependent on the meaning of those words. However, when our identity is free from that, then let somebody talk about consciousness however they want. Let them talk about brain, let them talk about matter, right? It's all ideas. A person is simply describing their experience, and all experiences are valid at the level of experience. The role for words is simply to guide the mind to another level of understanding, right? So for the purpose of understanding, we use words in particular ways, and yet we don't have to become bogged down or dependent on those words so that they become dogma. So at the experience of the second mind, there are no contradictions. The contradiction occurs as we vacillate back and forth from the first mind to the second mind perspective. So let's take a pause here. Contradictions appear when the sense of boundary is changing. If the sense of boundary is coming and going, and coming and going, then the way we see the world and experience the world can be tumultuous, or at least can change pretty dramatically, right? As that second mind establishes itself, then there's no more coming and going, and so there's no more experience of contradiction. Somebody said, all experiences are valid. Exactly. All experiences are valid. Experiences are experiences. We can use words. Words themselves are a certain kind of experience. We can use words to guide the mind to a subtler level of recognition. That is the use of words, and that's why we're taking pauses here, because the words have to guide us to a subtler recognition. All right? So there's no need to feel like an outlier or struggle to connect with people. Let the ideas go about what consciousness is. Let the ideas go about what the world is, and simply see the world as it is. And then appreciate and enjoy all the perspectives. Unless you're in a particular situation where a point is trying to be conveyed. Like right now, I'm trying to communicate a certain point, so I'm going to use certain definitions for consciousness. I'm going to use certain definitions for world, for physical. I'm going to use the world in select ways. If I'm having a conversation with someone else, a casual conversations, all of these definitions can change. I may say something that sounds the exact opposite of what I'm saying now, because that is at the level of words. At the level of experience, there's no change. Words are like toys, right? We play with them for a particular purpose, and we use them so long as we need them. All right. And the second question here, how does one, as a human being, remain in constant consciousness? How does one, as a human being? It's an interesting phrase that was added here. It's not just how does one remain in constant consciousness. How does one, as a human being, remain in constant consciousness? So again, this is speaking about the second mind, right? Remaining in constant consciousness is speaking about establishing as the second mind. So at the first mind level, that recognition can be difficult. In fact, the true recognition is impossible at the first mind level because the boundary is too thick, right? When we're talking about the third mind configuration, third mind is no mind, right? It is simply consciousness as it is, undeveloping, right? Not transforming, not modifying as the world. It is the essential, undifferentiated nature, right? So that is also not what is being implied here because of the specific phrase, as a human being. How does one, as a human being, remain in constant consciousness? So not just remaining as a human being, first mind, not just constant consciousness, third mind, but as a human being, being aware of the deeper nature. This is the second mind, right? So how do we do this? Remember when we talked about okay, so when we talked about the transition zone, right, going first mind, second mind, first mind, second mind, that's what's being referred to here, how to shift out of that. Remember, the difference between the second mind and the first mind is the sense of boundary, right? And what often happens is that a person is trying to escape that sense of boundedness, right? Who is trying to escape? The first mind is trying to escape itself, right? If we just zero in on it and look at it closely, the first mind that feels bound, that feels like it has that perimeter of boundary around it, that feels constricted within a particular location, this first mind wants to escape that sense of boundary, wants to escape itself, right? It wants more space. So we'll hear this phrase often, I need more space, right? Like, move out of my space, I need more space. So that first mind trying to escape is often the mechanism or often the method by which a person tries to move into the second mind. But usually what happens is that actually reinforces it, because it reinforces that I am this thing. I want to escape myself, right? I want to escape myself, which I, the first mind. And so whatever it tries, it kind of subconsciously or in an undetected way, it can reinforce that boundary. So once a certain amount of insight is there, the key is to simply sit and be with oneself and recognize the boundary, right? Shift the attention from wanting to get into some other state, shift the attention to the sense of boundary itself. All right? Shift the attention to the sense of boundary itself. What happens when we do that? When the attention is placed on the boundary, then what that happens is it recruits, as it were, it recruits the rest of our awareness that is already here, right? Remember, we're not buying new awareness, right? We're not discovering or we're not pulling in new awareness that's not already here. No, awareness is here, right? The full spectrum, everything is here. The only question is how much of it is being recognized and how much of it is being accessed, right? So when we shift attention to the boundary, right? That boundary, let's say the boundary between the first mind and the second mind. When we shift attention to the boundary, by nature, that attention is moving towards that second mind, right? When my attention is trying to get somewhere, what is it doing? It's actually hitting that boundary. It's solidifying that boundary. Just like if you work out, right? By working out and by stressing the bones, we're actually making the bones stronger, right? By stressing the muscles, we're making the muscles stronger. Similarly, when we try to push past that boundary, we're actually, in a way, reinforcing the boundary, right? So at some point, when there is enough insight, the key is to bring attention to the boundary itself, not trying to get past it, but simply bring the attention to that boundary. In so doing, that attention comes right up to the edge, and this awareness starts to seep in, as it were. Because it is only a broader awareness that can truly recognize the boundary. The first mind by itself cannot recognize that boundary. It's too hard, it's too difficult, right? All the emotions are stored in that boundary. Trauma is stored in that boundary. Every kind of trauma, the trauma of separation itself, right? The feeling of being separate and disconnected in and of itself is a trauma. It's a kind of trauma. But by keeping attention on this boundary from that transition state, slowly and surely that boundary will start to dissolve. Let's take a pause here. Be the witness. Kendra says, be the witness. No judgment. Yes. Yes. Be the witness, not so much to run away, right? The first thing is to witness oneself, to be with oneself, right? Not witness to run away from everything that's happening, but witness oneself, one's own boundaries. That's when the emotions come up, the sentiments start to come up, the old beliefs will come up. I can't do it, or no, it's impossible, it's never going to happen. All of these beliefs will start to come up. Let them keep coming up, right? Don't fight it and then reinforce it. Simply let it come up. Be with it. There is a time when that boundary starts to dissolve. All right? With everybody, it's different. Can you give more examples? Jill says, can you give more examples? We will get to some as we go through some of this book today. Because in the first chapter, which is called Missing Person of this book, in the first chapter, it actually talks a little bit about this kind of transition and what a person might experience. So we will talk about some of these experiences. Okay? All right. So that is, how does a human being remain in constant consciousness? Meaning, how does one establish as the second mind? Not by running away from the first mind, by recognizing it, by staying with that sense of boundary, and ultimately allowing that to dissolve. That includes so many different things in terms of dealing with the past, right? This isn't an escape from life, which so often it can seem like, right? When you hear about consciousness or higher states of consciousness, right? So many fancy words that we can use, right? It is not about escaping from the life. It is about a reorientation to the same life. It's a reorientation so that the very same experiences that we've had are seen from a different perspective. And as long as we have certain roles, right? Whether it's father, son, wife, daughter, whatever the roles may be, your role at home, role at work, role in society, as long as we have those roles, there is still the challenge of working with those roles. However, from a second mind perspective, we can see the lenses through which everyone is operating. It's helpful to see the lenses through which people are operating and why they say what they say, why they do what they do. And that helps to not be caught in that first mind framework, which allows very few creative solutions. All right, so the practicalities of living are still there. It's not an escape from life. It's simply the ability to see the full picture of what is here. And along with that, the ability to experience deep peace, joy, love, ecstasy, transcendence. All of these are aspects of the second mind. Renu says, yes, reorientation. Exactly. It's a reorientation or a reconfiguration of the mind. Okay, so the next question is, if nothing is permanent and everything is fragile, how do we find our flow to be at one with the universe? If nothing is permanent and everything is fragile, how do we find our flow to be at one with the universe? And this, again, is about how to be established as the second mind. So now, as we go through these questions and answers, it should be becoming clearer what we're talking about, right? What is happening with the mind? What is happening with the individual? What is the transition state like? What are the kinds of thoughts? What are the kinds of experiences that happen with the first mind? What happens in the transition state, right? What are people talking about when they talk about enlightening or self-realizing, right? This, what we are talking about, is a map of exactly that process. All right, so again here, if nothing is permanent and everything is fragile, right? So immediately we know that this is a transition state, right? If nothing is permanent and everything is fragile. So there is a recognition of the fragility of things, of the fragility of life, right? Life, not in its essential form, the fragility of lifetimes, right? Human beings have lifetimes. So the fragility of lifetimes and the impermanence of things. If nothing is permanent and everything is fragile, how do we find our flow to be at one with the universe? What is being at one with the universe? What is oneness? Remember, we talked about the ocean and the waves. The ocean appears as the waves, right? This is oneness. Recognizing the one appearing as the many. Oneness and multiplicity, two sides of the same coin. If it's multiplicity itself without the oneness, that's suffering, because everything seems disconnected. It's a life of competition, right? It's a life of scarcity. It's a life of not enough resources. It's every person for themselves. Like, all of these ideas exist at the level of seeing only multiplicity. Oneness doesn't mean only one. Oneness means the interaction between the one and the many. All right, so if nothing is permanent, everything is fragile, how do we find our flow to be at one with the universe? How is this second mind established? We talked about it a little bit before, but the key is, as long as the attention is on the impermanence, and as long as the identification and the relationships are with the impermanence, then this sense of fragility and the sense of not having flow will be there. Right? As long as the attention is with the objects that are impermanent, as long as we are vested primarily in the objects and in the modifications of our awareness, then there will be this tendency to not be in the flow. So let's take a pause here and return to the flow. Bring the awareness to the foreground. Okay? So if nothing is permanent and everything is fragile, how do we find our flow to be at one in the universe? And this is a matter of shifting the attention to that awareness itself, right? Yes, recognizing impermanence, recognizing the fragility of thing, and our attention not being primarily invested in them. That's the key. So just by recognizing that, that won't be enough, because I recognize it, but I'm still invested in it, right? So that dependency will still be there, and that sense of being carried by the waves is going to be there. The sense of flow comes from resting as that consciousness itself. And the flow that we're talking about is the rising and falling of perceptions, the rising and falling of perceived objects, the rising and falling of creating, dissolving, right? We know that all objects are permanent, right? We know that even lifetimes are impermanent, right? All objects are impermanent, all lifetimes are impermanent. So then the attention has to sink in and switch beyond just the objects and the lifetimes to that consciousness itself. That is the state of flow, the rising and falling of events, rising and falling of experiences, of emotions, of even the objects of our perceptions, right? As, for example, as I turn my head here, another perception arises, right? This perception is interpreted then. Turn the head another way, another perception is interpreted. So the perceptions are coming and going all the time. Emotions, everything is coming and going all the time. When that is appreciated, and it sounds like this person who is writing this question recognizes this, recognizes the impermanence and the fragility, then gently shift the attention to that which recognizes the impermanence. All right, so the attention is not on the objects that are impermanent, but on that which recognizes the impermanence. And what are we talking about here? These are all methods of transitioning from the first mind to the second mind configuration. Let's take a pause. Bring your awareness to the forefront. And what does that mean? We've just been talking about it. Recognizing the impermanence of these sounds that I'm making. Recognizing the impermanence of these words, even the impermanence of these meanings. What is it that recognizes this impermanence? Bring this to the forefront. Okay. And we still have 2 more questions. So most of these sessions look like they're going to be taken up by Q&A, which I think is good because from everything that you are writing here, the comments that I'm seeing, then it certainly seems like everyone has an understanding of what we're talking about. Everyone's right about in the same general area and having an understanding of what we're talking about. So the key here is not having to add more and more and more information, but simply plucking out the doubts, right? There's not that much to know. In fact, there's not anything to know because it's not about the concepts. It's a matter of plucking out the misunderstandings, plucking out the beliefs one by one. So we're doing that through this Q&A. So the next question. How does one use this knowledge in day-to-day life? Right? How does one use this knowledge in day-to-day life? Leticia said, like a kaleidoscope. Yes, like a kaleidoscope. In the sense that the one consciousness, through different perspectives, appears as the kaleidoscope of the world. Okay. How does one use this knowledge in everyday life? So the question here is, what knowledge are we talking about? Right? It's not knowledge of the concepts itself. The knowledge that we're talking about is our own knowledge, self-knowledge, right? If we're talking about the framework of the three minds, this is essentially a map of the process, right? Just like if I'm driving across the country to California from the East Coast to the West Coast, then there are maps that show along the way what are the landmarks, right? What are the ways to go? What are the detours? What happens if I turn left? What happens if I turn right? And that's exactly what the three minds framework is, right? It's a way to recognize the process that happens. Now, the framework can also be used to understand the different situations in the world, why people see things from different perspectives, right? Why people butt heads. No, this is the way to see it. This is totally wrong. There's only one way to see it, right? All of these are because people are seeing things from different perspectives, and people have different stories that are running, right? Because of the common stories that are circulating in society. So the ability to recognize these, the ability to see the lenses through which each of us is operating, these are some of the useful aspects of the three minds framework. Beyond that, how does one use this knowledge in day-to-day life? The knowledge itself, the map is used to look at oneself clearly and see where we are clearly. That is the greatest, most use of this, right? It's not to understand somebody else. It's not necessarily to understand the world. It's simply to recognize myself and my own process and what is possible with the mind. What is possible with consciousness, right? What is this thing? What is this word that we call consciousness? What does it refer to? What does it look like, right? What is the process like? So the knowledge itself that it leads to, right? Just as the knowledge that may be appearing in words now leads to silence, right? In our interaction right now, the knowledge that appears in the form of words leads to silence, where the real knowledge is ascertained. So similarly, with a three minds framework, that knowledge yields the real knowledge, which is self-knowledge, right? How do we use self-knowledge in day-to-day life? There's a much shorter list would be, how do we not use it? Because there's no way in which we don't use it. The sense of what we are, the sense of openness, the sense of creativity, the sense of being able to manage multiple situations, whatever happens, the rise and fall of events, the timelines, all of these become part of the nature of the second mind, right? So this is the practical, direct application of this knowledge. And this is why I often say that when we're actually looking at things, right, when we're looking at the way things are happening, it's not really about philosophy or science or spirituality or any of these. These are ways of categorizing experiences. The simple question is, are we investigating what is going on? Are we familiar with the lens through which the world is experienced, right? And are we becoming more intimate with that? Are we seeing how it influences things? So this knowledge is supremely practical in that sense. It goes beyond these types of knowledge to simply be the way that we're experiencing the world. And finally, last question here. A very short one. Please explain Kundalini. How many people have heard of Kundalini? So Kundalini, Kundalini is a word that is often used in yoga, right? And yoga means, one of the translations of yoga is union. Yoga comes from the root yuj in Sanskrit. Yuj, to yoke, to connect with, to join, union. So in the yogic traditions, they speak about Kundalini. And what is this Kundalini? Kundalini simply is the life force. Let's pause here. Kundalini is the life force. Now, there was a time a while ago, many decades ago, where people were talking about vitalism in medicine, right? Or elan vital, like a life force, an essential force, a vital force. And over time that fell out of favor. And we said, no, there's no such thing as the life force. We can't see it. I can't touch it. Therefore, it must not exist. So that idea fell out of favor. But in the yogic traditions, the recognition of Kundalini is millennia old, across cultures, not just in the Indian culture, across cultures, this is recognized. And Kundalini is essentially functioning all the time. All right? So this Kundalini is what is expressing right now in all of us. Okay? So speaking, right? Moving, expressing. This is all the force of Kundalini, the life force of Kundalini that is functioning in different ways through different channels of the body. All right. Now, usually what's referred to as Kundalini awakening is when that force is taken to a new level of activity. So generally the Kundalini is referred to as dormant in the body, right? When we say it's dormant, it doesn't mean it's not doing anything. It means that it is functioning at a certain level, at a certain percentage. Like if you have a meter, it's functioning at a certain percentage, right? And then that can then be activated to increase the function of that. Now, when we're talking about the first mind, it is essentially operating at a dormant level of the Kundalini. All right. And as the Kundalini activates, many other experiences can happen, including the shift in identity. The reason the Kundalini seems to be kind of mysterious and it's not talked about a lot, at least it's not described in detail with detailed instructions about it, is because it is extremely potent. Right? You may have seen people, or you yourself may have used psychedelics, and you can see how quickly a psychedelic can change your experience. Right? This is because it can work on the Kundalini as well. Working with the Kundalini energy directly can create dramatic changes in the experience of a person, just like that, quickly. Right? So much so that everything about them changes. Right? They're not able to function in the same life anymore. Right? Their perceptions can change. Their ability to work with other people can change. Their goals in life change. Their body will change. Their mind, the way they think will change. What they feel will change. Everything can change as a result of this. And so the Kundalini life force generally remains dormant, and over time, as a person starts to make adjustments in their life, then this slowly can be awakened in the right way, right? Kundalini is not something to be directly operated with generally without having guidance from people who have experienced it and who know its different manifestations, because everything can change all of a sudden. In fact, many people who experience what we call psychosis, it is the result of this Kundalini being activated either prematurely or incompletely or in certain ways, and not knowing what are the associated changes and the associated steps that have to be taken by that person in order to be able to assimilate these changes and still function at the level of thought and belief of the society, right? Because the first mind can be blown. The gaskets can be blown, right? It's like putting too much voltage into a device. And so it's important that one recognizes this. And the best way to go about this generally is to begin with our understandings, work on our experiences, look at what experiences we've had, start to make changes in our food, meditation, yoga, all of these things, and gently we start to wake up and see the deeper reality. All of this is completely unrecognized generally from the perspective of medical science. And because of that, there's a great misunderstanding about some types of psychosis. I'm not saying all types, but certainly some types are because of this. All right? So this is a little bit about Kundalini. All right. So all of these questions came as a result of last week when we began Is This a Mind? And we have just about 10 minutes left to go a little bit further, which is okay because again, these sessions are really about clarifying doubts, right? Let there not be any doubts that are holding us back in the first mind. Whatever doubts are there, let them out, let them flow, right? Just put them down on paper, put them down in the chat box, in the comments. I'll respond to some of them during the week, and I'll respond to some others next week in the broadcast. Right? The goal is to pluck out the weeds, pluck out the doubts, right? What happens? The vision clears, right? As the doubts remove, the boundary gets thinner, and we become established as the second mind. All right. So last week we were looking at the introduction. And there are a couple things in the introduction that we did not get to. So this is the book, Is This a Dream? I know many of you have it. I've seen in the comments that you're reading it. Let me know if you have questions, regardless of where you are in the book. This is available on the website. If you go to anoopkumar.com and scroll down to the bottom, there's a link for this book, and you can purchase it from there. It's available in paperback and in Kindle. So one of the things on page 6, for those of you that are following along with the book, on page 6, at the top, it says in italics, we talked about this before actually, there are no true contradictions, only apparent ones. All right, let's take a pause here. There are no true contradictions, only apparent ones. And the best example of these is the questions that we had, right? How do we recognize the world as it is, as the consensus reality? And how do we recognize the deeper nature, right? It seems like such a contradiction. The contradiction is because of the shifting mind. All contradictions are because it's being seen from two different perspectives, right? But when we see what is it that is appearing as those perspectives, what are the lenses made of, so to speak, then all contradictions resolve. All contradictions resolve, including is consciousness primary, is brain primary, all these kinds of ideas and experiences, all of these are reconciled, right? There are no true contradictions, only apparent ones. The greatest of contradictions, or the greatest of dualities, right? The greatest of opposite perspectives is what we call the subject and object perspective, right? I am a subject, and what I see out there, the wall, is an object, right? This is as stark a difference as there can be. Because we might say cold and hot are opposites, right? Cold and hot are opposites. They're contradictions in the sense that they're opposites. They're two opposites simultaneously existing, right? But in fact, they're not opposites when we recognize that they are grades of temperature, grades of activity, right? An increase in activity is recognized as heat. A decrease in activity is recognized as cold, right? So we say hot is one thing and cold is another, right? Hot, cold. But no, actually, they're not two different things. They're simply ranges of one and the same activity. Activity in one range is called hot. Activity in one range is called cold. Not only that, what is hot to one person is cold to another, right? Thermophiles living at the bottom of the sea or living at the edge of the volcano, right? What is hot to them is unbearable for us. It wouldn't even be called hot. It's beyond hot. So these two seemingly opposite things, hot and cold, become integrated. There are no true contradictions, only apparent ones. Furthermore, even this hot and cold is recognized by who? It's recognized by a human being or by a living being, right? It is the human being that says this is hot and that is cold. So in that sense, both hot and cold are experiences of a subject, right? So from one perspective, hot and cold are very different. But now I say, well, they're different in one perspective. However, when I recognize that both of them are experiences of a mind, both of them are experiences that are perceived by a mind, now they're similar. As perceived experiences, they're similar. As a distinct sensation, they're different. So are they different or are they similar? Right? When we appreciate all of these perspectives, all contradictions start to break down, including the biggest ones: good, evil, God, no God, consciousness, matter. All of these ideas, all of these experiences depend on a particular lens, right? So the greatest duality is between the subject and the object, because no matter what I think, no matter what I experience, what I feel, what I desire, what I've derived from experiments, what I've philosophized about, all of that is in a way an experience in relation to an identity, right? And so the greatest difference, the greatest duality is between the object, whatever it may be, that experience, and the experiencer, right? And the reconciling of that contradiction, that apparent contradiction of the experiencer and the experienced, the reconciling of that is when everything integrates and there are no more contradictions. Let's pause here. When the subject and object, when the experiencer and any experience is reconciled, then all contradictions are reconciled. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with everyone. It doesn't mean that everything is fine. It doesn't mean that there's nothing to say, right? It just means that we recognize the level at which the contradiction appears, right? That's why there's that statement that we don't solve a problem at the same level of consciousness as it was perceived, right? I'm paraphrasing. Because the level of awareness that recognizes a problem sees some kind of contradiction. This is happening, so that can't happen. This is this way, so that can't be that way, right? But what is the commonality underlying those assumptions? When that shift is there to a deeper level of the mind, then all of those things can be reconciled, right? So there are relative contradictions, of course, right? That's the whole, without relative contradictions, there cannot be any experience. There cannot be an experience of difference, right? There cannot be an experience of language. There have to be relative contradictions, this juxtaposed to that. This is possible, that is not possible. And this energy of this contradiction itself is what allows reconciliation and integration. The unwinding of that wound up energy that appears as a contradiction is that deeper state of mind. Sandra said, control our senses. If need be, control the senses. I'm careful about using the word control. Right? The senses are themselves. Shift the attention to that from which the sensations arise. Right? If I forcibly try to hold the senses, it's going to be a matter of time before they rebel. Right? Just like if a dog wants to run around and we just hold on to it tightly, it's only a matter of time. It's going to get more and more restless. You got to let it run. Right? But if we go to the source of the sensations, right? If we recognize the sensations that are rising and falling, instead of forcibly controlling them, recognizing the rise and fall, the attention shifts from the sensation to that from which it rises and falls, then the senses automatically come into a state of balance. It's not that they're controlled. They come into a state of balance. We need the senses, right? We need the senses to function in the world. So let the senses, maybe if it's too much and it's going wild, certainly there's a practice in which we can bring the attention back and maybe control it. But it's really about shifting attention to the deeper layer. All right. That was a quick hour. I wanted to talk about one more thing. I'll just read this and then we can go into it next time. But these couple lines on page 7. We are now upon a time in which our perspectives on spirituality, science, philosophy, and religion have evolved enough to stand together in the glare of the spotlight as we ask the most practical of questions. Right? In other words, well, we'll get into it next week. But our perspectives on spirituality, science, philosophy, religion, and everything else, theology, technology, anything, have evolved enough. Our understanding should be deep enough now to stand together in the glare of the spotlight as we ask practical questions, the questions that actually change our lives. What are those questions? What is the common truth among all these? Among all these apparently different aspects of life, what is the common truth? How does it change my life right now? Right? What's the use of talking about some truth if it's not changing our lives? And how does it change the world? These are the 3 fundamental questions. What is the common truth? How does it change my life? How does it change the world? How does it change others? How does it help the situation that we're in? Right? It's not about a particular type of knowledge. It's not about a field of knowledge. It's not about which person is right. It's about seeing the common truth among all these. Let's pause. Thank you for being here. Check out the book, Is This a Dream? It's available through the website. If you want to work one-on-one, there are consultations available on the website anoopkumar.com to dive into more personal type questions or a unique type of situation. I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I will see you here next week, Wednesday, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for being here.